Hi there. This is John, your New Testament instructor, this time coming to you from the comforts of my own recliner at home. Isn't online coursework wonderful? You can do anything, anytime, anywhere. And now it's time for us to talk about the epistles, the letters in the New Testament. The Gospels definitely form the core of the New Testament because they tell us all we know about the life and the teachings of Jesus. Jesus didn't write any of his teachings, but the gospel writers did. They tell us the teachings of Jesus, some of which make a lot of sense to us and are very easy for us to do. Some of which, when it comes down to gut level reality, are very difficult for us to actually put into practice. Something within us really wishes we didn't have to. The letters of the New Testament demonstrate how the early church put the teachings of Jesus into practice in everyday life. Yes, the letters will have a lot of theology in them, as in a lot of the church doctrines and everything are based on them, but you also see practical reality in the letters. You see the authors telling us how to live the teachings of Jesus. And now it's time for us to talk about the greatest letter writer of them all, a man named St. Paul. I want to give you a short presentation just to prepare you for what you will read in St. Paul, and then you will read all 13 of the letters attributed to him. And I'm tempted to tell you to read them in chronological order. Some things may make a little more sense. People tend to get bogged down in Romans. I encourage you not to do this. When you read his letters, remember that you're in a survey course, you're not in a Bible study. And if you read anything in any of these letters, especially in the letters of St. Paul, that piques your interest, trust me, I have lots of references that I can give you. I want to start with a warning before you dive into these letters. I found this quote a very long time ago and find it incredibly appropriate. You may have heard of a guy named Alexander Pope. He wrote some very famous poetry in English literature, and he says, "A little learning is a dangerous thing. Drink deep or taste not the Pierian spring." There are a lot of people out there who think they know everything there is to know about the letters of St. Paul and thus about his theology. It will not surprise you to know that people have written entire libraries full of material on the letters of St. Paul. Several years ago, I preached through the book of Romans in my pastorate, and in the course of preaching through that book, I began my studies literally with the apostolic fathers and came up through writers in the 21st century. Practically every generation has had to deal with St. Paul in some way or other. So as you go through these letters, understand once again that you're getting a very brief overview, and there's always more that you can read if you come across something that really piques your interest here. Now, we know from the historical studies that the Greeks wrote lots of letters. As a matter of fact, every so often in Egypt, somebody will uncover a treasure trove in a trash heap or something like that because the Egyptian climate is so conducive to storing things, to preserving things, and so forth. And thus far, we have uncovered two types of Hellenistic letters that the Greeks of that time wrote quite frequently. The first is the literary epistle. Someone is writing to a group of people somewhere. Maybe it's a treatise, maybe it's a group letter, such as the letter of Romans or Galatians, or maybe it's just something that they need to say to an entire group of people, and therefore they write it more almost like a book, which we call the letters actually books as well. Then you have the personal letters. In the personal letters, you will have the author of the letter writing to one individual. And we have examples of that in the New Testament as well. St. Paul wrote a letter to Philemon, the owner of Onesimus, and St. Paul wrote letters to St. Timothy and to St. Titus. So you have St. Paul really engaging in both types of letter writing depending on the circumstances and depending on the goal that he intended to accomplish with the letter. You can basically break these letters down into certain parts, and you see this very frequently, especially in St. Paul's letters. First off, who's sending the letter? The author of the letter will identify himself in some way or other. No, Paul, Paul, so-and-so. You go over to the letters of St. Peter, and he says, Peter to, and then he says to whom. Same with the letters of St. John. So anyhow, we know who sent the letter. Then you come to the recipient. Maybe it's I, Paul, to the Corinthians, or to the Church of Galatia, or to something like this. We pretty much know who wrote what to whom based on their use of this style. The greeting is also very important because it was very common in Greek times for people to greet the people they wrote basically with grace to you or something like that, and wishing a blessing of the gods on the people, on the recipient. This brings us to St. Paul. St. Paul took the greeting and Christianized it by using terms that the church would recognize as specific to them. Something along the lines of grace and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ, or something. And then we'll have a Thanksgiving that everything's going great. And of course, Paul will say, I thank my God for you always, or I thank my God or something. It's rather interesting when you get to the letter of Galatians that St. Paul completely omits the Thanksgiving and dives right into the body. Notice that when you read the letter to the Galatians, that lets you know, and don't worry, the Galatians caught this, he is mightily perturbed. Something has gone seriously wrong in the case of the Galatians, and I promise you the omission of the Thanksgiving was not accidental. St. Paul knew exactly how they would react. Which brings us to the body. It's in the body that you will find the practical assertions of the teachings of Jesus. It's in the body you will see where St. Paul expands on the teachings of Jesus. And especially, you will see him using all of these references to the Old Testament. Now, you're taking New Testament survey and therefore don't have the advantage of having the Old Testament background unless you have already taken Old Testament studies somewhere else. If you haven't yet, I encourage you to. But St. Paul, once again, was incredibly well versed in the Old Testament, and he extensively used the Old Testament to reinforce his teachings, to bolster his point, and you will find a lot of references to the Old Testament. Once again, the letter of Galatians is a beautiful example of that. Then after he writes the letter, after the body of the letter, he will have a farewell. And in practically every one of St. Paul's letters, you will see him say hello to this person or say hello to this person. Generally, it was accepted that the scribe who wrote the letters would say something if he knew someone in that case, someone in one of the churches, and then they would close. Basically, St. Paul would close with something along the lines of the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ or the love of God be with you all, something along those lines. We know that Paul's greatest ministry remains his letters. Yes, he took the gospel into the Greco-Roman world. Yes, he took a basically Jewish faith and introduced it into the Western civilization, but it's his letters that remain his greatest ministry. His letters still speak to us 2,000 years later. Now, we have 13 letters in the Old Testament that are traditionally assigned to St. Paul. Here's one of the things that you will read quite frequently. Some people disagree about whether he wrote this letter or the authorship is disputed on this letter. And they will try to say, well, someone wrote this letter in his name. It's pseudographical, they call it. Big word there that basically means somebody wrote pretending to be Paul. I would point out to you that the early church recognized these letters as authentic. I would also point out to you that anyone trying to write a letter to some of these people would find very quickly that was a very crazy thing to do. They would know whether St. Paul wrote it. Once again, he's tossing out names at the ends of these letters that verify he knows people, and that he knows people to whom that will hear these letters later on. Now, one thing in our Bible, in the New Testament, you will find that the letters are arranged from longest to shortest. They're not arranged chronologically. I have a chronology here shortly that I will show you. So remember that you're starting with the longest of St. Paul's letters, the letter of Romans, and you are going down to the shortest letter, the letter of Philemon. Now, there are several terms in St. Paul's letters, and you've got this huge long list here of things that you probably need to know if you're going to understand some of the stuff going on in Paul's letters and everything. Justification, huge word, big word, especially in the book of Romans, because as I say there, you're kind of declared to be righteous in the sight of God. In Paul's way of seeing things, really no one has the advantage over anyone else in being born justified. No one deserves to stand before God in the courtroom. There's this old saying about the man who stands as himself for a lawyer has a fool for a client. No one in their right mind would try to argue their own case before a judge. And in the case of justification, it means that we have been given the right to stand before God, declared innocent, righteous, not because we are, but because God says we are. That brings us to the word righteousness. It means basically right living. You're living according to the standard. Who sets the standard? In Paul's mind, in Paul's way of thinking, God alone sets the standard. And we must live according to that standard. Now, if we fail to live according to that standard, then we have sinned. Sin is basically falling short of God's standard. And then we must respond in some way to his invitation to right the relationship. This brings us to faith. I'm going to go to the next slide here so you can see the last three verbs here. There's the last three words here. Faith. Human response to divine truth. What do I mean by this? Well, the divine truth is that Jesus died and rose again. Paul calls this the core of the gospel in 1 Corinthians, the 15th chapter, that Jesus died according to the scriptures and rose again. And faith means that we respond to that in some way. We trust that Jesus' death and resurrection has accomplished something for us. It's not just a case of saying, well, I believe, so what? It's a case of the belief doing something, changing something in our lives, in our hearts. The only thing is, we don't deserve the right to stand before God. We don't deserve the right to receive this faith. We don't deserve the right to believe that God has done something for us. This is called grace. Grace basically is just undeserved merit, getting better than you deserve, whereas mercy is also tied to this. it's not getting what you really deserve. So as you go through the letters of St. Paul, just keep a lot of these terms in mind. I have a document later on that you'll have to flip through. It looks very similar to this, and you can keep that document handy as you're reading the letters of St. Paul. I told you I'd come to the chronology, and here's the chronology. You have him writing probably Galatians first. We know that he wrote Galatians before AD 53, but most likely Galatians right around the time of the Council of Jerusalem. Probably as early as 48, but we really don't know. It's about a 5-year range there. We do know that he wrote 1st and 2nd Thessalonians very early, right around 50 to 51. As a matter of fact, he had to write to the Thessalonians to try to tell them some things he didn't get to tell them because, of course, he was chased out of Thessalonica. Then he wrote the letters to the Corinthians, and remember that he will write about 3 letters to the Corinthians. We have only 2 in the New Testament. He wrote Romans in 57 as he was getting ready to go to Rome, to possibly on a mission trip. He wanted to have the Roman support, for the support of the Roman Church for a mission trip to Spain, and he wrote this letter to introduce himself. Wow, what an introduction. Then you have what we call the prison epistles that were written about the time that St. Paul was imprisoned in Rome, awaiting trial before Nero. This includes Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. I love the book of Ephesians. If I ever need the joy reinforced, the book of Ephesians will do it, and I believe that it will pick you up as well as you read through that book. He wrote 1 Timothy and Titus right around 65. You'll notice this is after he has been freed by Nero. The book of 2 Timothy is the last book we have written by the Apostle Paul. The last letter we have. It was written right before his execution under Nero in AD 67. And with this, the ministry of St. Paul comes to an end. Not his influence, his ministry. I hope that you thoroughly enjoy reading these letters. I hope that after you've gone through this survey course, you will take the time later to study these letters more thoroughly. Please keep in touch with me, and I will do everything I can to give you any kind of materials I have or can get access to that will help you to understand the writings of one of the greatest authors in all of history.